He was told he'd be playing a god. They gave him lines to memorize, a gilded breastplate, a wooden sword painted to pass for bronze. What they didn't tell him was the ending. In every version of this myth, the god dies. And in this arena, the myth was literal. Centuries later, archaeologists pulled this from a drainage channel beneath the Colosseum's wooden floor. A bone fragment scored with marks that don't match any catalogued Roman weapon or any known predator's teeth. A forensic team noted it in a footnote. No one followed up. The gates rose, light hit him like a wall, and with it the smell, old blood baked into sand by a full day of sun. Behind a secondary gate, something massive moved. One of the handlers stepped back. He wouldn't look at him. What happened next was not an execution. It wasn't sport. Rome had a word for it, but the Romans themselves stopped using it within a generation. Because some spectacles were designed to be performed once and never written down. If documented history still matters to you, stay close. But to understand what this man walked into and why 50,000 citizens laughed instead of turning away, we have to go back. Not to the beginning of the games, to the lie that started them. Subscribe to Crimson Historians. We go where the textbooks stop. Here is the version you were taught. In 264 BC, in a cattle market that smelled of dung and smoke, the sons of Decimus Junius Brutus Scaever buried their father with blood. 3 pairs of slaves, armed and told to fight until one of each pair stopped breathing. The Romans called this munus, a duty owed to the dead. Borrowed from the Campanians and Samnites, absorbed into Rome like everything else Rome touched. From there, the story writes itself. Grief became tradition. Tradition became spectacle. Spectacle became state policy. By the time the Colosseum opened in 80 AD, death was Rome's most reliable public institution. A clean arc, piety to bloodlust. It fits neatly into a chapter heading. And that's the problem, because clean stories in Roman history almost always mean someone edited them. Livy records that the funeral games of 264 BC drew a crowd far larger than a private ceremony could explain. The Forum Boarium was a cattle market, no seating, no stage, yet thousands appeared, as if they knew what was coming, as if this wasn't the first time blood had been spilled for an audience in Rome, just the first time anyone wrote it down. One more thing, the Brutus family's funeral archives were among the first Roman documents to be selectively edited by later historians. Small changes, dates adjusted, names omitted, the kind of revisions that only matter if someone is controlling a narrative before it's been finished. Most people stop listening here. That's why history keeps lying. But the lie isn't in the dates, it's in the motive. Because the textbook version says, Rome stumbled into arena violence. What if it didn't stumble at all? By the 3rd century BC, the Senate had a problem it couldn't solve with legions. Rome's population was outgrowing its capacity to feed, employ, or contain it. Veterans returned from wars, expecting land that didn't exist. The urban poor packed into apartment blocks that collapsed so often, the city kept permanent rubble-clearing crews on salary. The Senate didn't stumble into blood sport, they architected it. The Ludi Romani, religious festivals for Jupiter, were retrofitted with gladiators, not because crowds demanded it, but because the Senate needed a ritual that made obedience feel voluntary. And in the center of it all, men killed each other, wearing the armor of Rome's conquered enemies. The Samnite with his heavy shield, the Thracian with his curved blade. Every fighter was a political cartoon, and every time one fell, the crowd was rehearsing Rome's supremacy. The arena was a loyalty oath performed in blood. Imagine the experience from the stands. You arrive at dawn. The air is cool, tinged with animal dung drifting up from below. Vendors push through selling olives, garum at twice the price. Children run between rows. It is, in every measurable way, a day out. Below your feet, separated by 15 feet of stone and sand, a man in painted armor is learning that the animals have not been trained, that the wooden sword will not be replaced, that the second act he was promised does not exist. He can hear your laughter through the floor. This is no longer about what happened. It's about why it was allowed. And the answer is worse than cruelty. The answer is that nobody in those stands thought they were doing anything wrong. The system was designed so that participation felt like patriotism. The violence wasn't hidden, it was celebrated. And that is not a society losing control. That is a society functioning exactly as intended. When Emperor Titus opened the Colosseum in 80 AD, the inaugural festival lasted 100 days. Ancient sources claim 9,000 animals were killed. The number appears in multiple accounts. Historians repeat it dutifully. Nobody stops to do the math. The Colosseum's hypogeum could hold roughly 200 animals at capacity. 9,000 across 100 days means constant resupply. Caravans arriving before dawn, ships docking with caged beasts from 3 continents, an entire logistics operation running beneath the spectacle, invisible to the crowd, essential to the show. The games weren't events, they were supply chains. Pliny the Elder noted that animals common in certain regions, a generation earlier, were becoming impossible to find. North African lions, Atlas bears, hippopotami from the Upper Nile. He treated this as curiosity. Modern biologists recognize the signature of systematic ecological collapse driven by a single consumer. The arena didn't just kill animals, it emptied landscapes, and the scarcity was useful. Every year, the beast grew rarer, the cost rose. Every year, the cost rose, only the wealthiest could afford to stage hunts. Extinction was profitable. But the animals were only the visible cost. The supply chain that moved 10,000 beasts also moved people. Prisoners, condemned men and women catalogued and transported with the same precision as the lions they'd eventually face. And what happened to those people underground is something Rome worked hard to ensure nobody wrote down. The gladiatorial system was not what most people imagine. It was a regulated industry. Training schools called ludi operated across the empire. The largest, the Ludus Magnus in Rome, connected to the Colosseum by underground tunnel. Inside, gladiators followed strict dietary regimens. Physicians developed surgical techniques on arena fighters decades before those methods reached civilian medicine. Bone fragments from gladiatorial barracks at Ephesus show advanced cranial surgery. The same empire that built elaborate systems for killing these men invested heavily in keeping them alive, not compassion. Accounting. A trained gladiator was worth more than a Roman house. The care was real. The motive was profit. And the profit depended on the men being healthy enough to die spectacularly when their number was called. But not every fighter was an investment. The system created a category called the Noxii, the condemned. No training, no real armor, no chance. They were prisoners, deserters, people captured in the wrong war, given wooden shields and blunted swords, and placed opposite trained killers or starved animals. The system needed them, not as fighters. As contrast, their terror made the gladiators' courage legible. Their helplessness made the crowd's cheers feel earned. Manufactured victims, built into the architecture of the spectacle as deliberately as the trapdoors in the floor. And then there were the gladiatrices, female fighters. Roman literary sources mention them with contempt. Juvenal mocked them. Domitian staged fights between women and dwarfs as novelties. The written record treats them as jokes. The physical evidence says something different. A gladiatrix burial in Southwark, London, with grave goods consistent with a professional fighter. An alabaster relief from Halicarnassus depicting 2 women, Amazon and Achillea, in full gladiatorial equipment, not costumes, professional gear. The literary sources mock them. The archaeology says they were common. Someone was lying, and when you find that gap between what Rome wrote and what Rome did, you've found where the real story hides. Everything you've heard so far is what Rome was willing to put on record. What comes next is what they tried to erase. The morning belonged to animal hunts, the afternoon to gladiators. But the midday slot, when casual spectators left for lunch, belonged to something the schedule listed, but the histories rarely describe. Damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. The midday executions were not filler. They were the main event for a different audience. The senators and elites who stayed through the heat were watching a curated catalogue of consequences organised by crime. Deserters mauled by wolves, forgers had their hands crushed before the beasts were released, arsonists burned. Each death was a category. Each category was a warning aimed not at the poor in the upper tiers, but at the powerful in the front rows. And the cruelty demanded artistry. The condemned didn't just die, they died inside stories. A man convicted of arson was cast as Hercules, strapped into a tunica molesta, a shirt soaked in pitch, and set ablaze while a narrator described the myth of Hercules, consumed by the poisoned shirt of Nessus. The fire was real, the screams were real, but the structure of the myth gave the audience permission to watch. He wasn't a person anymore, he was a character. Characters are supposed to suffer. A thief was dressed as Orpheus, given a lyre, and pushed into the arena with animals starved for days. In the myth, beasts sit in awe of the music. In the arena, the lyre played for 11 seconds. The poet Martial, who attended, noted that the bear was unimpressed. The worst was the reenactment of Pasiphae, the queen cursed to desire a bull. A condemned person was placed inside a wooden contraption and a bull released. What followed was the deliberate fusion of sexual violence, mythology, and public humiliation, performed for an audience trained to interpret suffering as narrative. Seneca attended the midday executions once. He wrote that he left more cruel, more inhuman than when he entered. But the detail that matters is what he saw in the crowd: educated, literate citizens sitting through systematic torture and feeling nothing. Not excitement, not disgust, nothing. The arena had normalized the unthinkable so completely that cruelty no longer registered. It was just the midday slot. If stories like this disappear, we don't evolve, we repeat. But Seneca only saw what happened above ground, what happened beneath the arena, in the hypogeum, in the corridors where prisoners waited listening to the deaths before theirs. That is what Rome tried hardest to keep out of the record. The Colosseum's hypogeum was not a basement. It was a machine. 36 trapdoors, hand-cranked elevators lifting animals and people from darkness in seconds, corridors wide enough for 2 carts, drainage channels angled at precise gradients to move blood away from the surface fast enough to keep the schedule running. Recent excavations revealed what the literary sources never mention. Graffiti scratched into tunnel walls by people who never left, tally marks, names, crude drawings of animals observed through cage bars. These were not the words of criminals. They were evidence left by people who had time to think about what was coming and chose to prove they existed. Some waited hours, some waited days. They could hear the crowds above, the beasts in adjacent cages, the mechanical grinding of elevators lifting the previous victim into position. Every death before theirs was an audition for their own. The waiting was part of the design. The bone from the opening. Analysis showed the score marks were made in sequence. Animal teeth first, then a bladed metal instrument applied after death. Not a fight, not a feeding, something staged, where an animal and a blade were used on the same body in that order. No Roman source describes this procedure. None. The most bureaucratic civilization in the ancient world documented shipping manifests, sewer schedules, grain inventories. The absence of this from the record is not an oversight, it is a decision. Here is what changes when you see the full picture. For 16 minutes, you've been watching a story about Roman cruelty, an empire that turned death into entertainment. That framing feels natural, because it's the framing Rome's own critics used. Seneca called it inhumanity, Tertullian called it demonic, but they all shared the same blind spot. They assumed the violence was a corruption of something better, that Rome had a moral baseline and the arena fell below it. It didn't. The arena was not where Rome lost its humanity. The arena was where Rome demonstrated it had never intended to extend humanity to everyone. The Noxi, the prisoners, the slaves, they were not treated as people then subjected to cruelty. They were classified as non-persons first. The cruelty was downstream of the classification. The games didn't brutalize Rome. Rome was already organized around the principle that certain lives existed